Okay, so it looks like we're recording now. So yeah, welcome everyone. This is the kind of kickoff first API group. I mean, we've actually covered, over the past couple weeks on the other meetings and obviously just random chats, like some of the topics today. But this is kind of the first focused API group. So let me get my screen shared. Okay. Cool. So yeah, so just, a little intro. We'll go over kind of the current state of the SDKs and just kind of where things are at. One of the sub items, but it's a little bit bigger topic, is kind of CAL readiness with the current state. We can kind of touch on upcoming SDKs. We had, I think he's going to be here today as well. I think there was an Alex yesterday who's going to be.
I'm here.
Oh, hey, welcome.
Hey. Thanks.
So yeah, since you brought up kind of Python stuff yesterday, we can talk about, it seems like Python is a known one. I know there's been some other ones brought up. One thing I'll point out leading into that subject, I already saw folks on PHP filling it out, but if you guys go to the docs, and we should do this for the other components as well, but I was thinking it's pretty good to really, it's one thing to see handles and people asking questions, and then you can kind of correlate. If you're asking a question about the Python SDK and you're saying you're implementing something, we know you're kind of working on it. But I think it's good if we start working towards documenting who's working on what, where they're located in the world, who they work for, or they're independent. And then a key one, which might not seem key, but it is really key, part-time, full-time. And part of this is just so everyone can kind of know each other, and if there's coordination, time zones and whatever. The other thing with like who you work for in part-time, full-time is even, we're going to be growing. And even in the small, more intimate group that we've been, even within the same org, we've had some like miscommunication about who's going to take on what task. And someone's like, well, I'm only part-time, or hey, I was on vacation and no one really knew because I'm not full-time. So it's not really my job to like tell people what I'm doing with my life outside of working on stuff. So these are just good little pointers so that if someone's working on a task, for example, and the task is too big and they need to fork it off and see who else can work on it, you maybe don't want to assign it to a part-time person if they already have one or two tasks that they're working on, right? So these little hints. So we can kind of start filling out that specifically around like the SDKs, and we will probably end up doing it for the other items as well. So yeah, so if you are working on any stuff, so for instance, like Alex, you can, obviously you've been asking questions and just, fill out stuff for Python. I imagine there's going to be at least one or so other Python people that pop up.
Yeah. Is there a link to this?
Oh,
sorry.
Yes. Oh yeah. So go, if you are in the Slack, it's in the bottom of the Slack API notes file. So here, actually, I will.
Perfect. Thanks.
Actually, for others, in case you're not on the Slack, where it is. So I just put the meeting notes. Okay. Yeah, let's flip back over. Okay. So, and then just discussion Q&A, there's some subtopics there. They're both in the meeting notes as well as here. So currently the ones, actually, let me zoom ahead so you guys can think about it. So on the last slide deck, if you guys hop on there, if there's anything else, throw it in. I'll just bring it up at the end. So currently, I want to touch on something that we talked about in this week's testing meeting around kind of goals for coming up with some bar for supported SDKs. The assumption is nothing will be supported until we come up with some bar that everyone's comfortable with, and then you have to meet or exceed that bar to be a supported SDK by the community or internal or both. Most of that is going to be reflected around testing and documentation. I kind of want to touch on, we're going to be covering this a little bit heavier in the coming week or two. What's dubbed the metadata features. There's an improvement proposal that was backfilled from some documentation that the EU team was putting together. So we can touch on that. We don't have to drill in too deep, but I want to bring it up because it is going to be a pretty big feature in that even though it's an additive feature, it has a potential big effect on how people use almost every aspect of the protocol. Specifically, like for instance, where I proposed the first topic is really around Apostle and how a new version of Apostle can be revved to take advantage of it. So in the Apostle group meeting, we will cover it in a little bit more detail, but it will touch in several groups. So I wanted to bring it up today as far as APIs and just mental readiness. We had the topic talking about the reactive kind of approach, and should we try to standardize it? And then yesterday someone brought up GraphQL, which is more appropriate here in the API one. So anyways, this is the current discussions that we'll kind of get to as we move along. So if there's anything else, keep these at the forefront of your mind. And anything additive, just throw it in here, or just raise your hand as we go. So we can kind of like jump right in. So just current state of SDKs. Some of this might be repetitive for those of you that are actively working on stuff, but let's just assume a kind of a lowest common denominator of kind of newbies to both the community and the tech stack. So going under nemtech for the group and the organization. The link here is just literally does a search on all, quote unquote, SDK repos. So we have the JavaScript, TypeScript, SDK, Java, C# library, which I'll touch on in a second, and then the Python SDK. So for all intents and purposes, you can kind of assume that, the way we're communicating it now is that really the JavaScript, TypeScript SDK is kind of the only supported one. And we use that lightly because we're still updating it for Cow, and we'll talk to that in a little bit here in a later topic. So the goal is going to be to kind of get all of these back up to speed and up to the supported mark. So kind of almost consider these to be dead repos, zombie repos outside of the JavaScript one. Shintat, you'll cover some Java stuff. But obviously, you guys are kind of doing it outside. We'll try to coordinate about merging back in and whatever. But when we get to this kind of supported mark, we kind of want to have the repos kind of live here. That's like a certain mark that the community and the organizations behind them are going to support, and they're meeting some level of quality. So that's kind of, let's say, the current state of it. I
would like to interrupt you shortly.
Yes.
So there's also Nem2 Swift SDK and Go SDK outside of nemtech.
Yeah. So I'm kind of talking about it from like a community perspective right now, like from the organization. So like, for instance, the people that are working on those are essentially not around, right? Like they're working on them, but they're not participating in the Slack. They're not participating in any of the community efforts currently that I know of. Okay, so like really it's around who's going to be participating. So if someone off in some corner is working on an SDK, if it's functional and you like it and it works, great, use it. But when it comes to what we're marshaling under nemtech, people, if we don't know about them, they have to come to us. So we do know that like Proximax is working on their Swift SDK and Go, but I haven't heard a single thing from them as far as what's the state of it. Have they been working towards Bison readiness, Cow readiness? They're working off their own fork. So we'll kind of create our own kind of goals, and then people that are working on the outside can either join those goals or work on their own forks. I mean, that's completely fine. And a lot of those, to some of them will be highly functional as well and need a certain quality of their own support. So the goal is essentially, like, so for instance, you also see that there's no PHP SDK, but there's, through the foundation, there's an effort to have people focus on building the PHP one. So those people will start to build outside of nemtech. And then once things get up to a certain level, the decision will be made whether or not it becomes a nemtech SDK or if it stays as a community supported SDK, which still might meet the high qualities. So a lot of that just is going to come down to kind of what the community and the group decides is this level of supported, using my air quotes here.
Okay, clear.
So does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So you can find them again under here if you haven't already kind of poked around the repos. as far as kind of where things are at, so the cow release itself has been out for a little while, and in the last 6+ weeks or whatever, we've been working towards kind of getting feature parity for at least starting with the JavaScript SDK. Again, using that as our kind of standard one. We'll have Craig kind of go over some more details in a second. So a big thing for the project when it moved from release 1 to 2 to 3, 3 being cow, the move from Bison to cow was pretty heavily breaking as well as additive at the API and SDK layer. So there was a bigger effort to update things. So that's kind of, let's say you can think of that as the biggest focus right now is this kind of feature parity to say, hey, let's get everything cow ready so people can actually really start using it at least at the JavaScript level. And hopefully fast followers will be, Java, and then the other ones will come in at their own pace. In the move from cow to dragon, the nice thing is, at least as of now, the dragon release is, we shuffled around some items in that it's going to be a little bit more weighted towards underneath features and kind of hardening and updates. So it's not going to be as jarring at the API or SDK layer. There might be, there's going to be some additive things, but there's not going to be breaking changes per se. So in cow, a massive breaking change was the split of a new handling of mosaics and namespaces. So Dragon is more kind of additive and let's say a stabilizing release. So we have this, let's say, window of time between where we are today with getting some base level for cow and where Dragon will come out, that all the SDK efforts can kind of think of it as a little catch-up time, right? Because they don't have to implement a lot of new stuff. Now, of course, for new SDKs, everything's kind of new in a way. But at least you're not chasing this constant moving goal, right? Like the goal is going to be moving a little bit when we get through Dragon and Elephant and whatever F becomes. So as we look towards, the future towards Dragon, once we can kind of eclipse this goal on cow readiness, which is really coming soon, and Dragon is going to be a little bit about, besides new SDKs coming into the fold, really this approach of kind of upgrade rewriting. So, we've learned a lot and then the project's kind of evolved. So we're going to be kind of working through some JavaScript, TypeScript SDK rewrites where we're taking what is currently split between the library and the SDK and kind of merging the two and then doing away with a lot of code that can be kind of ditched based on cat buffer support. So we're trying to move everything towards standardizing on these cat buffers. For anyone, whether or not you're interested, can you raise your hand or throw in the chat if you're familiar with cat buffers and kind of what the general concept is there?
Well, I believe what you're saying is totally right. Dragon is a stabilizing release, so including and merging library and SDK is also something that will stabilize everything. So putting cat buffers in there is totally right.
Yeah, and so basically, so yeah, it seems like either people are kind of chiming in and familiar. I'll just in case, and obviously for people that aren't familiar, since we are recording this and sharing it with people that aren't attending. So in general, like cat buffers, for those of you that are developers or not developers, there's these kind of data serialization libraries that have existed in the world. If anyone's been using things like Thrift or protobufs or Avro in the big data space or whatnot. So cat buffs is essentially the similar concept for Catapult and coming up with a standardized data format where basically you can kind of come up with this definition language that can then kind of generate the stubs and the kind of supported formats for certain languages, and then you kind of leverage those and wrap them directly. So the goal is instead of writing complex, potentially brittle code, you basically the project can kind of generate the base for you. Of course, you need to have a certain level of stability at that level, but at least it makes it so you're not trying to hand code serialization across different every language and version, right? Like once you get into the generator mode. So cat buffs is a nice update for that. The effort started a while ago. It's used at actually, let me open up. There we go. So there's the cat buffer repo. There's going to be a lot more activity going into it. Currently, C++ is kind of like the main generator that's supported. Actually, I think it's listed in the README. 1 second.
Yeah, when I was looking about a week ago, it looked like it was the only one.
Yeah, and so currently, Java effort underway, JavaScript effort, which there is one, but it needs to kind of go through an update in prep, so that will be coming soon as well. So the goal is with this, if we talk about the current state of things, that besides kind of getting the general framework together for Python or PHP or whatever, it'll also be looking at it through the lens of cat buffers and having an equal related effort for the language and saying, oh, let's create generators for those. And for some languages, depending on how things shake out and how resources are available, maybe some things are maybe bypassed, but the goal is to kind of make that kind of the baseline. That's the hope. So again, it's not exclusive to Dragon, but think of where more of this cleanup, stabilizing stuff is going to be happening in and through Dragon, because there's not as much movement at the top layer. At the the protocol, the SDK, the API layer is not really going to be moving as much. A few additive things, and then there'll probably be a few revs at Elephant, but again, it'll be more additive than breaking. So that should hopefully help. And then the last thing I'll just kind of touch on for like the current state of the SDKs. I mean, this isn't exclusive to the SDKs, but it seems like there's going to be more bodies working on the SDKs than most other parts of the project. Is really like have everyone, I mean, not everyone has worked in a wide range of collaborative or bigger organizations before. So depending on everyone's personal and professional background in software development and open source. So we really want to try to have this kind of collaboration goal. So kind of some things that we've seen, it's not necessarily bad, but we've seen almost this kind of carving out of different efforts. Like, oh, well, if you guys are doing the XYZ SDK, I'm not going to touch that. I'm going to work on this other one, right? And so in some cases, it makes sense not to have, like, we don't need 8 people working on the Java SDK. But it is nice to have this collaborative effort. That's really kind of what the open source community and project's about. So if, for instance, Alex, like you're, focused heavily on the Python SDK, instead of everyone kind of stepping off and being like, okay, well, Alex is going to handle it, and if he works with another guy, great. But it would be nice to have a collaborative effort, right? And that might mean one org has a person focusing on cat buffer, one has it working on testing, another org has, Alex is working on core stuff, and then bringing other people in and kind of leading that effort. So everyone kind of try to have a mindset of collaboration, and we're not trying to create an environment where we're carving up the SDKs into these little fiefdoms, and those are the only orgs. So part of that is just better, let's call it better community practices. Part of it is, redundancy. So I'll give the example of, hey, there's a bug or there's a new feature that needs to be added, and Sally is on vacation for 2 weeks, or something's going on and she can't work on something for a little while. So then you're kind of in this waiting effort for someone else to kind of either volunteer or show up or be assigned. Whereas if there's a little bit to a smart amount of overlap, it's just kind of like, whatever, throw that in, next sprint, that's going in my bucket, just reassign it to me, or I'll just pull it off the queue from the issues and reassign it, right? So again, just generally, everyone kind of have a mindset of like collaboration as kind of a goal. Again, not exclusive to the SDKs, but I see the SDKs having the biggest amount of kind of contributors ramping in the next, whatever, let's say month. So everyone, again, have that kind of mindset, open mind. And if any questions or issues or whatever, just speak out or raise your hand in the Slack. But that collaborative communicating is, hopefully everyone will work more efficient with each other. So kind of moving on, I touched at Cal Readiness, but I kind of want to zoom in and kind of hand off to the people that are kind of leading these kind of efforts. So we can start with Greg and the JavaScript stuff, and then Shintat kind of hand to you for the latest on the Java side.
Yeah, thanks. So basically for the JavaScript SDK, it's ready for core-based features, I would say, all transaction types except account properties, but all of the transaction types would work with that. I believe, yeah, the breaking changes didn't make it very easy, also with the library, and now thinking about merging the library as well. That's going to make it a little chaotic, or at least that's how it looks like. But I believe it reached a good state right now, and I think it's version 0.10.2. That one is co-compatible, and I believe from there we can move very much better, I guess.
Okay, nice. Let's see, we got a message in chat. Okay, yeah, Shintat was just bringing it up. Yeah, I mean, this guy kind of like touched on before. So for those of you that aren't familiar, essentially there was actually, I'll just speak to it instead of opening up more browser tabs. So basically, there was this thing called it still exists, and it powers the stuff under the covers. There's the nem library, and library is kind of doing the core lifting at the kind of API data layer, and then the SDK is kind of like leveraging / wrapping it, as well as obviously thinking of like the CLI tool and stuff. And there was a couple of reasons for that. One of it was kind of design and learning from the lead developer that kind of took a similar pattern on nem version 1, who did nem library there. A big thing is around making, it kind of was making testing easier. And we covered some of this in the testing group meeting this week. But essentially, by the introduction of cat buffers to handle the kind of do all the lifting and management at like the format serialization level, and new tooling and approaches to testing, it doesn't make it 100% irrelevant, but it makes a good chunk of the library irrelevant. So by also wanting to, this was also created basically a year ago. So we've learned a lot in the past year. Projects moved a little bit, and we're moving in some new directions for data format and serialization as well as testing. So now is like a kind of a window of time to like take the hits and essentially scrap SDK instead of managing 2 repos and having them work together. Have one, reduce a lot of code, leverage cat buffers, do some cleanup, introduce new testing suites, etc. So that's kind of the driving effort behind that. So yeah, everything Greg just talked to is really, let's do, the goal with Cow was, hey, Cow's been out now for a little bit. Let's do a quick and dirty kind of pass to get the feature set up in the background in parallel. Let's start to think through the redesign and,
If I can interrupt very fast, co-compatibility is reached almost, I would say, but I think there's still enough. And if people want to contribute to the SDK, fair enough. There's enough work on there, I think, because cat buffers is not integrated currently and stuff. So co-compatibility was only one step. I think now comes also another good chunk of work.
Exactly, right. And some of this goes to let's say the collaborative effort. So this is where I don't want people to have a mindset of, oh, well, Greg's working on the JavaScript SDK, so whatever, I'm going to go elsewhere. If people are interested in things, raise your hand. If there's nothing for you to work on, or it's not the right fit, then that'll be discovered after the fact. But if you're a JavaScript developer, and junior, senior, mid-level, doesn't matter. If you're interested in fixing bugs, if you just want to help out on tests, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Definitely join the JavaScript effort, right? Or PHP, or whatever. Join whatever is interesting that you think you can add value, even if it's just maybe helping out on testing and documentation. Again, wherever any bit of help is great for the project as a whole. So yeah, actually, I was also touching on Greg's point. Let me go back. So we are, as he mentioned, like we're close. We're kind of in the final stages of verifying a couple items. So potentially in the next 24 plus hours, maybe, we will kind of have the we did the cow release on server right after New Year's. We will do the SDK, and we'll also be updating the Bootstrap tool so developers can leverage that for their test environments. And that will leverage the latest. We actually dropped a new dot release yesterday, which will kind of go out in the same group of things. So yeah, and then Greg had added some links here. So if you're interested, these are in the presentation as well.
Just to interrupt again,
Yep.
I put the alpaca link in there, so because I'm guessing some people are also still working with alpaca or maybe bison. So
Yeah, hopefully not alpaca. I mean, there's definitely going to be, oh, whoops, I think, is this probably, I imagine this is.
Just saying, so the people have the link. This is the old version you have to install if you want to work with your old network. And the two co-links are obviously the new ones.
Yeah. I assume this is bison.
I guess the library link is maybe not important. No, that's a library.
This is cow. Oh, okay, I see. I thought I was looking at alpaca.
Important. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Fine.
Yeah. So yeah, those are interested. Kind of look at those. Yeah. So I guess Shintai, you want to kind of give a update from you and your groups, kind of currently, getting up to speed on the Java stuff, and kind of what you're targeting there as far as the effort, and talk about kind of where you guys are at.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, basically, I'm still working on the cat buffer serialization. I've come some progress. I've made some progress, but the bytes are not working out a little bit here and there. So I don't know why it's always coming out in verse. So I hope to finalize by that by this week. One of my team members, Chunam, he's in the call. He finished the conversion of the shared log SHA, I think, from 512 to 256, and made a pull request already. But unit testing for that is not updated, so we posted that on Slack. Jeff got Alex Braz from Brazil to help out with the SDK too. So Alex is familiar with Java, and I think he's closing on to making a pull request for the DTOs. And Ravi is also a Java guy. He's a senior developer, and he's now working on the namespace mosaic split. So he's following a lot of Greg's progress on the JavaScript, TypeScript SDK updates. So, but of course, that's quite heavy because a lot of us have never touched the SDKs before. So we're kind of like trying to execute everything as fast as possible, but still learning the SDKs design pattern and whatnot.
Also feel free to coordinate with me with the effort on the co-compatibility. I got to know pretty much every new feature, so maybe just communicate. Also, if you have questions, don't hesitate on the Slack. So I'll be
yeah. I see that most of your conversation happens in the Mattermost. But so yeah, we're trying to shift a lot of the conversation in Slack. So I have communicated with my team that everything should be posted on Slack because I'm not the go-to guy. I'm just passing down the information from what I understand. So yeah, I do encourage participation on Slack, definitely. But developers being developers, we are usually shy. So sometimes when we do have help, I guess it's the shyness to ask, but I try to promote that still. And yeah, I think that's pretty much the updates. Am I missing anything? No, yeah. So I'll paste some of these issues that's on the GitHub because some of the team members already have raised the issues and been and commented that they'll be working on it. So yeah.
So while you're just talking, I'm just setting up. Can you guys, Shintak, and you and your team, you don't have to do it later, right now, but can you fill out your details on the, Java section? I just added a Java section in the notes so that those people you mentioned, they're just kind of known, and as people ask questions, we'll figure out where to document this. We'll probably document it in one of the repos or someplace, so that if people are talking or trying to coordinate an effort, again, a lot of this will come later, probably when new features or changes are coming, where it's kind of like, hey, we need to like make sure everyone's on the same page. So let's like force these people to get on a meeting so that we can communicate this upcoming change. So anyways, yeah, again, no rush, but just kind of fill out the details there. But yeah, definitely awesome. Thanks for the updates on that. It looks like we got someone else chat. Oh yeah, just said sure. Cool. Okay, so that was kind of Java update. And again, there is other kind of obviously, started or pending to start efforts, but these were the two that were kind of focused on like getting stuff specifically for Cow. And then we kind of deem everything else as kind of upcoming support, which, speaking of which, is kind of like a good segue. Yeah, I guess if there's if no one in the group, none of the attendees have questions about actually Cow readiness or the JavaScript, kind of efforts, I guess raise your hand now, else we'll kind of scoot on to talking about kind of known upcoming efforts. Anyone? Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Since people were filling out stuff for PHP, we know that's kind of intended, whether or not it started. So I guess Alex, if just, I don't know, do a little intro and talk. I mean, like you were kind of been most active in the past, I guess, week plus, as far as just asking questions and, as far as approaches to Python. We obviously the reactive conversation, kind of came up out of that. You were kind of chiming in about Python
Definitely
style. So I guess we'll just pause for a second, give a little intro about yourself and kind of your current thoughts and your interactions online to get feedback from people about the approach that you've been taking. I know the conversation's going on online, but you can kind of give like a little recap.
Hi, I'm Alex. I previously worked for a company. We developed an SDK for the NIS1 version. So it was a relatively unofficial SDK, but I'd spoken with Jeff, and so he asked me to develop an SDK for Catapult. And so Python has a somewhat different take compared to a lot of different languages, because like it's a fairly high level glue and everything like that. And reactive, for example, isn't, it's not that it's as popular, it's just that everyone has like the async IO API tends to be pretty poor and people don't like it. So everyone has their own way of doing asynchronous code in Python. So it's been great to get some feedback. So I've been working with Cat Buffer, and I've been slowly accumulating to all the different changes that Catapult has introduced for compared to the NIS version 1, and I've been having pretty good success. So I'm basing right now everything unofficially off of the current version of the TypeScript SDK, but it's working very well. So yeah, thanks for having me, and nice to meet you.
Nice, yeah. Welcome to the community and the Python efforts. Anyone else who's on? Either because don't know all the attendees, but anyone else who's on who's either a Python person and thinks or knows they will be contributing in some way to Python, can you guys kind of like either speak up or raise your hand or both?
Well, hi everyone. I'm David. I'm the docs guy, and basically I started the Cat Buffer implementation for Python. It's a little bit stopped right now since it's not updated the reference one, that it would be like the JavaScript one. And I would like to give my input as not from the development point of view. I won't be programming the SDK, but I would like to give some insight of how can we do things. And at the end, I will test a lot the SDK while writing documentation. So I will be happy to help where it's possible.
That sounds great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm currently creating a private GitLab repository, but I'll definitely add access, and then I'm going to publish it once it's a little bit more, once the bare bones has been fleshed out onto a public repository. So I'll add you as a contributor shortly.
Perfect.
Great.
Thanks.
Awesome. Any other Pythonistas out there that are currently on the call or the meeting? Okay.
I do have one question.
Sure.
So Python tends to, and partially that's because of how mature, like it has a lot of different tools. So for example, for HTTP clients, there's things such as Tornado, which is basically a giant kitchen sink for industrial scale long session applications. And then there's stuff like requests and AOI HTTP, which are just simple like HTTP clients. It's very easy to generate basically wrappers for those APIs. So that way everything, you can basically use the backend that you want. It's not really a question of like the interface. It's just like, for example, Tornado is something that's developed by Facebook, and it was originally developed by something else. So the idea is that like it's hyper optimized for when you have like a long running session. And so the kind of question is like for some of these tools, there can be like more efficient implementation. There's assumptions, and there's a less efficient implementation, but it requires a lot less assumptions. So anyone could probably install, for example, anyone can install requests. It's pretty much considered the gold standard for a simple HTTP client, and has been proposed to be added to the standard library, although the developer doesn't want it to. So like a kind of question of, should we have, for example, modular backends where if there's more features available, we can then use it? So for example, if Tornado is installed, then we can use Tornado, but by default, we just use like, for example, a simple HTTP client, or should we just go for the simplest in all cases?
My first feeling is, in the case of Python, I mean, I've never professionally worked on Python projects. But from relatively familiar with, interfacing and using some, not just for Python, but for any project. This is why I kind of had some of my responses I did on the reactive conversation. Mm-hmm. When you bring up things like, Tornado requests, my first gut feeling is to, keeping it as simple and slim and stripped down as possible. And so there's a couple, like not making any kind of assumptions based on someone's environment. So in the case of, reactive, it's kind of like, well, not everyone needs or wants to build reactive asynchronous solutions, right? They just want to have synchronous, like, hey, I'm in an app, I make a request, it pings a server, which pings a network, pipes back a result to me or something, right?
Yep.
So along the same lines of a Tornado or the like, there's two points there, particularly with like a Tornado or whatever, is like, one, inherently this, like these networks aren't scale out to the level of normal applications and services.
Yeah.
So one thing when you start talking about like a Tornado and a Facebook, and I think Tornado originally was really popularized with Friend Feed and the team that ended up going to Google, or whatever, if I remember correctly.
Oh, Facebook bought them out, yeah.
And so in those scenarios, like having as an option maybe as like a side thing, but for instance, I guarantee there's a ton of people that are like, well, I've standardized on like Nginx for my like socket connection and HTTPS termination and whatever, so I want that to front everything, and then I'll run my container services behind that. So I think things that start to bleed into high level of scalability, when blockchains and Catapult as a high scale blockchain is still not going to scale to any significant amount of transactions per second compared to normal apps. Definitely. Now you could say, I want to support something that can have 50,000 socket connections for read and, and gets. That's where I kind of, again, my mental knee-jerk reaction is like, well, supporting those at the SDK layer versus whatever your app container and service is, right? So like in Java, supporting that at that layer versus, whatever Jetty or something else you're using, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or something, right? So those are, again, that's my initial kind of.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That sounds great. That was my initial kind of sort of guess. I've built it so that way I have like a modular framework, and so then I've plugged in, for example, request to work into that. So I've got like a simple API that's abstracted, and then request plugs into that. So it's very easy for me to add in a new backend, but it's very nice when you ain't gonna need it. Just don't worry about it now.
Okay, nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then someone had we got user FVM. I know there was a guide for developers on starting up or working on Nem2 SDK. Will it get updated? The answer is yes. We'll probably have to have some focus time. I guess maybe David, can you speak to that? I haven't actually looked at any recent stuff around.
Yeah, David,
working on
that you can probably chime in again.
And unfortunately, everything has kind of gotten tossed on him for docs. But this is actually a perfect area where I'm not going to call out, you, Greg, or Shintat, but like all of you people that are working on, you guys are going through the pain right now to like onboard. The hope is that you guys can work with or for David to produce the new generation of this. But David, go ahead and speak to it. Okay, so here's the guidelines for development. So I guess as far as yeah, go ahead.
You can open the document that I put there in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, so, well, this guide is a little bit old, but it's getting updated more or less every week when we have like something new now that the SDK is being updated again. And basically we talk about the architecture first, and then if you scroll down, every component is more or less described. So there is like a way to start developing an SDK, but there are like some things that are not documented yet. For example, how the keepers and cryptographic stuff is generated, or let me think, or the transactions serialization, how will be done with cat buffers, right? So as soon as we implement a new SDK and we have this knowledge available, it would be great if some of you can contribute to the documentation, like put what you have researched, and we can like merge the pull request, maybe edit it a little bit, so the next person who does an SDK has this task easier. So this guide was started with Aleix and Guillem, and with the knowledge we have right now, it has been updated a little bit, but it has not progressed that much because during some time the SDK has been a little bit stopped.
I'm just adding a note for next steps about the action, about add. Maybe David, for the next doc meeting, we can add a topic specifically for this. Kind of like in the beginning, you just did I think our first one you did like just how to add a guide. Maybe we can literally do a specific session about adding something to the guidelines, and then work with Greg and the teams to like populate some content and use it as a reference example. So to next doc meeting about SDK dev guidelines. Add more there. I'll just add that for now. Let's see what else we have. Okay, so FVM says thank you. So where were we? So we were talking about so we kind of organically segued us into the from the upcoming SDKs as we started jumping into specifics on Python. It's like, hey, I just inserted a new discussion topic specifically around Python SDK. So let's just jump into the discussion. Again, anyone else who has a topic, just exactly what we've been doing, raise your hand in the chat window or just speak up. These were some specific ones I wanted to bring up. So along the lines of kind of standards and goals for supported SDKs, we don't have to go into too much detail, but basic concept is essentially that we kind of touched on in the beginning a little bit, that we set some bar, right? And right now our mindset is that bar is documentation and test driven for supported SDKs. So some things we went over in more detail. Let me actually open up somewhere. Where is it? Okay, here we go. So if my window's still showing for everyone, there's this nem2 scenarios repository. And we talked to this some in the testing meeting. I just put it in the chat window. So essentially, we're going to try to come up with, and we're not going to be too strict about it, but we want to try to come up with some baseline of like test scenarios. And currently, through the effort of Wayne, who's, I think I saw him on it earlier, might still be on, essentially coming up with the scenarios that David had collected and started writing up. Let me just open one up. So, alter asset supply feature. So he kind of started documenting and writing these features and kind of test cases. We're leaning towards at least a starting point is to implement something like Cucumber and Gherkin, and then starting to build test suites around that. And so a potential hope and goal is for the SDKs when we start, we're really going to start focusing a little bit more. There's a lot of like unit testing on the server side and like the protocol level stuff that the devs have been doing. But now it's like, hey, we have, let's start doing more end-to-end testing and API testing. And as the SDKs come up, obviously that's a key area for everyone to kind of feel solid about their SDK. So obviously those of you that are developing or working on the SDKs, do whatever level of like unit and like maybe functional level testing, but we kind of want to work together to come up with some base style of end-to-end testing that kind of wraps the SDK. So we want to test things in isolation, but then say, hey, I should be able to test the SDK against a functioning server and run through this test suite and it passes to some extent, whether it's 100% or 97 or whatever. So the hope is that we can kind of like rally around at least some base set of test scenarios and functionality, have them in documentation, and then say what's documented sets a baseline to what we also want to have test scenarios for. And then in order to deem supported, there should be a test suite that runs against the SDK. And whether that means there's a little like bug on the GitHub repo that says, build passing or not, we can figure that out. But it just kind of makes everyone kind of work in, again, collaborative, focus effort, right? So if a change is introduced, there's a relatively somewhat, let's say straightforward checklist to say, hey, this new feature is coming out. Let's educate everyone on it. Okay, now let's document how it's going to be implemented. Okay, now maybe let's update cat buffers. Okay, now everyone implements it. Now we have these 3 new test scenarios that are going to exercise it. And then everyone can kind of work on their own pace to kind of coalesce around that effort. Now this isn't easy. We don't just like wake up tomorrow and, have this type of thing, but it's a goal, right? It's like this continual improvement goal that we want to kind of get to. So those of you that are on here that will be obviously writing maybe your own unit testing, also consume this idea that, we want to set some kind of goal and bar for documentation and testing so that your thing can be qualified. So I guess, Alex, with you, a good example is you're going to create your GitLab repo and then you'll make it public. And then probably what we'll want is you to merge it over to GitHub so we can be on the same set of tooling. And then it lives there and everyone kind of works to professionalize it. And then at some point, if we say we want this to officially be supported, we will introduce kind of these benchmarks. And they're going to be it's not like a hard standard. Like, hey, if you don't meet 100% on these scenarios, it's a no-go. It's, we'll kind of feel it out. But that's kind of what everyone kind of collaborating together and giving feedback on.
Definitely.
That seems to make sense. And we don't want to be too overbearing, but we also want to set a certain bar. And kind of what I touched on that Isfan brought up earlier, we also don't want to be too overbearing on others that are like maybe not standardizing on NEM style catapult, right, for the NEM public network, that they're running their own, fork private network. We don't want to, try to force them down a certain path. In theory, if we're doing a good enough job as a community, most of these things should be additive and welcoming to people where it's like, even if they're working in their own bubble, they can kind of borrow off of our kind of standards that we're setting, both at the docs and the kind of testing level. So anyways, I just wanted to bring that up as a discussion point. If anyone has any questions, We don't need to dig in too much. If you're going to be working on testing, I highly will recommend and want you to be on the testing group meetings. We're going to be doing more of those. We just did the first one this week. We won't probably be doing weekly, but maybe every other week. Stuff's moving pretty fast there. Wayne, who's kind of, think of it as test lead as of right now, kind of evaluated a bunch of frameworks. He's going to be working through some Java stuff and cat buffer verification. And he kind of got through and did a presentation and just talking through his experiences evaluating a handful of frameworks. So if you're interested, join the meetings. You can go back to the previous recordings. We have them posted for the first meeting. You can kind of skip through it and get the gist of it.
What day and time are the testing meetings?
This week we did it on Tuesday at 2:00.
Okay.
Next week it will not be Tuesday. So we probably won't do one next week. So currently the consensus has kind of come up in the past 48 hours that everyone kind of seems to like 2 p.m. Pacific time, 22 GMT as kind of the current community meeting times, where it's not too early in APAC. It's late, pretty late, depending on who you are and what your family situation is in the EU. So we were talking about where certain groups and efforts might slant towards APAC or Europe region. We can kind of slant times to be more inviting to those regions. But we brought it up in the last couple of days and people kind of kept saying like, well, just keep it the same. So as of now, think of this time frame where almost all meetings will be this. And like this week we did 3 meetings. Next week we'll probably do 3 meetings. And I imagine not too far off, we'll start having 5 meetings a week that where not every group is meeting every week, but we have more than five groups that will be popping up. So not everyone has to join. We do the recordings and the notes. So if you are busy or need to sleep or whatever and can't join, that's fine. If there's particular topics, we definitely want to be accommodating, especially for those that will be like presenting. So we did that, I think, I can't remember now, too many meetings, but one of the meetings, someone's like, hey, I want to like go to bed. So we said, hey, we'll just move thanks for the heads up. We'll just put your agenda item first. You can present and then pop off and, offline and go to bed. So everyone kind of communicate that, but we'll kind of keep it the same. So actually along those lines, there is events.nemtech. Is it nemtech.io? Isvan, what is it? Or github.io?
Say again.
What's the, is it just nemtech.io?
Nemtech.io. So
Okay.
without the GitHub.
So Isvan set up a nice shared calendar. We'll be updating here. So definitely, bookmark this. We'll be using this more, but also, like we'll be kind of like we've been doing, posting in the Slack. We'll try to almost always give, let's say more than 48 hours notice, but the goal is to kind of schedule a week ahead. So currently today, potentially next Wednesday will be client meeting. Next Thursday, possible docs, maybe not. Tuesday, possible apostle meeting. So those aren't locked in yet. We're trying to, figure that out.
And also, it's not quite obvious, but if you click on the link, it will take you to the Zoom event. That's also quite handy.
Okay, yeah, we'll have those links. And currently we're using the same Zoom for everything. We might end up federating that as more meetings are happening. We don't have to do it yet, but I guarantee at some point in the next 6 to 8 weeks, we're gonna have to do multiple meetings on a single day. It's kind of organic because we're adding, currently we've been at the special interest group level, which is kind of all the core stuff. We're gonna be moving into working group level kind of next week and beyond. So currently we only have a couple working groups, but it's not outside of realm. We might have 3 or 4 within a couple months. So that's kind of, we got a little distraction, but that was kind of standards and goals. So I guess any questions about this idea of coming up with some benchmarks around testing and documentation for SDKs?
No, I think it's great.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, so another thing we won't go into too much detail on, but I want everyone to kind of be aware of it, is, where is it? The metadata feature. So, yeah, so basically, if you guys haven't seen it yet or seen it referenced in Slack or the improvement proposal, basically there's this feature that's just dubbed metadata feature, key value association and storage. So the basic idea at kind of a protocol storage layer is being, people have used, let's say, or used would be one way to refer to it. Abused would be a different way to refer to it. Not just with NEM, but other like blockchain protocols. Essentially used and abused, there's a certain amount of building blocks in the protocol. And you have, mosaics as your assets. And you have a certain level of, description, message field. You have accounts, and those are like a different variant of assets. Accounts are owners of assets, and you can append messages on. So, people are kind of using, over the last handful of years on V1 have used these in different ways. The biggest example of that is probably Apostle, where Apostle did it in such a way where it takes the document object, makes that an account, and then uses, hangs data off of it to kind of maintain provenance of versioning and information and the actual hash, stamp and verification of it. And then if you want to like pass ownership, you're essentially passing off ownership of that multi-sig account. So that's like a really good example. But there's kind of an infinite amount. Like essentially, if you're not just using a core quantity-defined asset that the blockchain supports, and you just pass those around, just like Zem and other mosaics, you essentially are hacking together some form of the building blocks and tools. So metadata came about from a couple of reasons. One is people are kind of using and abusing what's there based on the limitations that exist. The second one is, well, if you look at messages and you look at things like description, which exists as kind of a formalized thing in V1 and unformalized in V2, and then you look at subsequent other metadata desires, you can kind of squint and say like, well, they're all kind of the same, right? So the difference between, maybe a message and a description or a name, these things that aren't core values that the protocol is using, like quantity and, immutable or transferable or not, everything else can just be considered almost generic metadata values. And so the idea is essentially both at the account and the asset, mosaic level, is to allow this the definition and association of key value pairs. So in the case of, let's say, something really generic and boring like description, key, description, value, foo, right? In the case of Apostle, it might say, well, now I have the ability to drop some specific metadata on these different objects. I might want to rework how I'm doing my own like little sub protocol. So that's basically the idea. You can read through. It's still, it's a lot of the details are pretty hardened. We need to kind of update some of the docs on the improvement proposal. And then we've kind of lightly opened it up to discussion a little bit more. Again, the one that it has immediate impact on is kind of Apostle, right? Say, hey, let's maybe come up with Apostle V2. You guys start discussing, which has happened. So there is the Apostle working group, Slack channel and the like. So again, we don't have to go into all the details here, but it's basically a feature that's coming. Let's say it's about, the idea is 70 to 85% hardened. And then as people start to ask questions and think through it more, there's currently a dialogue, live dialogue have it happen in Slack. Kind of specific things, you can kind of see some comments, a lot of these around a couple of the Apostle interested people that are working on stuff. Like here, you'll see yours, bring up like, non-fungible token, access controlled. And so anyways, for those that are interested, obviously today's been like this type of stuff falls under the API group. Today's been heavy SDK kind of slanted, but obviously if you're working on SDKs, anything that gets exposed at the protocol, subsequently API layer, you're going to probably be implementing in the SDK layer. We're definitely not there yet, but and we're not quite sure which release this will fall in, but maybe assume elephant right now potentially, depending on how the next 6 weeks go. So I'll pause there. I guess any questions? Again, we don't have to like drill into it, but ask if you're interested, ask questions now. Else. Conversation after the fact online.
Yes, so I have a question about this. So you say 80% is hardened. So you will update this issue with more details on how.
Yeah. I mean, so the goal was to kind of just get the conversation started. There was the doc. So how this all we had a shared doc that we started on. I don't even know, October, November.
Yeah.
And the doc was locked, so we couldn't. It wasn't usable. So I just started retyping stuff here. So I typed as much as I was interested that day, got it started the conversation, threw it over the wall to the Apostle people, since I saw that as being the most immediate kind of effort conversation need to happen amongst them that are actively working on it for V2. So yeah, they're like more needs to either be copied out. I mean, I notice, I think when I was scrolling down, right, like you put some stuff, I think some of that stuff is maybe from the doc. Yeah, so like this thing, right? Like this was another thing in the doc. I was like, well, I don't have time now to copy the table in. So I kind of put the high level. So yeah, we can kind of copy these things back up into the top. I'll try to do a pass over the weekend and see what's there. But we'll probably do, maybe not, let's see what other topics, but sometime either the next API meeting or the one after, we'll probably do a specific focus, maybe not the whole meeting, but a good chunk of it on just the metadata stuff. So we're kind of letting, again, the Apostle group will be kind of heavily influencing, since it'll be most jarring to Apostle, rewriting a V2 potentially. Again, there's been conversation there. That will be the big topic in the Apostle group meeting. And then that input will be reflected back into this. If there's, if the Apostle group says, this is what we want, what you guys are talking about seems to make sense, great. But, they might give some input saying, oh, I want this. Another one is the introduction of a security token group or whatever, right? That will also have some influence. But most of those things have actually influenced the definition of this, so I don't see there's going to be too much movement. So these have been things that have influenced it from the beginning based on just early conversations.
Yeah. In my opinion, I think this feature will be quite big and will add a lot of more use cases for NEM. So yeah, looking forward to it. Yeah,
it's pretty. We've been the original. So I tried to introduce the first version of it in May of last year. We've been kind of pushing on it and then backing off as other stuff has kind of made priorities. So we've kind of been deferring. So we're finally kind of getting to that point to where, actually maybe for the first anniversary of when we were trying to introduce it last year, we'll kind of get the first drop of some of the early parts of it. So there's some prototype stuff internally the devs were experimenting with, and it was like, hey, this is going to take too much, so let's table it while we continue to work on some stuff under the covers, especially on the storage format. Yes, anyone else questions or comments on metadata? Okay, cool. Maybe not to beat a dead horse, we already talked a bunch about the Python stuff. It kind of originated. Oh, we got one. Seems great. Yes, thank you. So real quick, again, we're not going to kind of solve it here today, but I want the conversation to continue. It kind of stems off of the tornado conversation from earlier. This one actually preempted it, that Alex had brought up. But the conversation was raised saying, hey, we were having a conversation, and RX Java, which is now just reactive design and the wealth of libraries across all the languages, that was used in the first versions of the SDK in JavaScript. Maybe we should be using that for all of them. And I had replied saying, maybe, but maybe not. And let's start the conversation. So that's kind of what this is about. And again, we're not going to solve it today. Anyone who wants to chime in, similar to the tornado conversation, I think Alex, I assume you were the one that proposed this kind of, at least for the Python example, the wrapper that could, do the facade so that you could use reactive or non-reactive, right? So I think that's a great example. So again, my gut reaction and feeling from an architecture perspective and productization perspective is I usually shy on the side of like minimal and not imposing things on developers. So like not saying there's two levels of imposing. hey, Mr. PHP developer, you have to implement the reactive libraries for PHP in order to implement your library that we want you to do for this SDK. Now you can do that, but that's going to add time to the development effort and maybe a level of complexity in debugging and testing and sharing and onboarding more people. So there's one plus or minus there. One level is it does kind of, let's say standardize. So if every library were to support it, there is a plus there. The other thing I also kind of brought up just from a gut reaction feeling is making the assumption that having really great, slick, reactive async functionality is really what people want. And that if you were to take a pie chart of applications in the world that exist today and that will exist a year from now for blockchain and Catapult stuff, that they will be event and reactive driven type apps. And it's not going to be 99% of apps, and it's not going to be 1%. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. I guarantee it's probably going to be over 50% are not asynchronous focused. Most of them will be like, clients that talk directly to the network. Some of those might try to open connections and keep them persisted, whether it's WebSockets or other. So anyways, those are just some initial things. And again, like, I'm not really religious one way or another. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the developers that are building the SDKs and everyone kind of collaborating together and giving their input. So anyways, let's say the conversation is like kind of starting. But as those of you that are working on your SDKs, Python, PHP, Java, JavaScript v2 or other, please participate and give your input and experience. So Alex gave his first input of like, well, I'm thinking about it. Here's one way that we could actually support both. So we can launch without it and then have this facade such that it's transparent for those that want to implement it, right? So that's like a perfect example of the kind of collaboration we're trying to bring out. So I'll pause there. Anyone have any questions or comments?
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
So basically for Python, when we're using the ED25519 algorithm, I know that we're using a SHA-3 hash function rather than the traditional SHA-2. So this is fine from a pure Python standpoint, but from a pure Python standpoint, since it uses arbitrary precision integers for everything, it's very susceptible to timing attacks. So that's fine if we warn the client and everything like that, but I'm not really sure what your stance is. It's fairly trivial to make another library that essentially uses C and publish that, which would basically prevent carefully coordinated timing attacks and make it fairly optional. But I'm kind of wondering just what the general standpoint is. And this doesn't have to be answered now. It can be answered in the future. But essentially what the approach to, let's say, client security would be, because it could be that in a situation where if a client is actually handling secrets and they're signing them using the Python SDK, they might not want to use it if it was if the ED25519 algorithm is done in Python.
Yes, so that's actually good. So I just hopped over and added a note as far as next steps, call to action. This is definitely a topic. I think you actually, again, you're the one's been bringing up the Python stuff. I remember seeing a question when I was looking at the backlog on the Slack where there was some comment about this. Hey, should we implement something in C and then kind of write a wrapper for it, right? Leveraging what's there, right? So definitely this is a topic that should be definitely shared on the Slack and then have a wide range of people input. Mm-hmm. So if we look what would be implemented, so for instance, like currently, all the core is written in C++. There's Python, there's Java and whatever. And so I know this was actually brought up like last year at some point. I can't remember in what context. This is before the Slack was used and even existed. Someone brought up the idea of like, hey, maybe we do implement some core specific stuff at C and then kind of force the SDKs to leverage and build little wrappers around that and leverage it across like a wide range of SDKs. So this was something that came up non-topic around like, Python, SHA-3 timing attack stuff, but it was similar in vein that like, hey, maybe there's a level of reuse and core development if we implement this stuff, in C and then leverage in other languages.
So one good thing is, so just fairly quickly is that there is a good ED25519 wrapper that is done in C, but is basically accessible from Python. But it uses SHA-2 for the default hashing algorithm, not SHA-3 like we use. So it's fairly trivial just to fork that repository and then basically republish it as because it's permissively licensed and all that, and then basically make it an optional extension. So what we could do, and this is what I'm kind of been defaulting to, and I'm not sure if it's the right approach, but basically have it as an option to depend on that repository, which will be fairly well tested and everything like that. I checked to see if anything else was available, and it's not. And then if that's not, we can go to a fallback Python version, which would warn the user if they try to use it that secrets might leak without just using the warnings module. I'm not sure if that's a good approach.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that sounds, reasonable. I mean, I think it's good in these scenarios to have, well, one, be thinking about these things and, protecting and having a certain level of support and quality of protection. Like, hey, use this SDK and you don't have to like worry or think about it if you do these things, kind of disclose that. And then in scenarios where it's either not possible or people don't want it, you can, it's like use this potentially unsafe version depending on how you're implementing it and what environments you're in, right? I guess the analogy would be, it'd be kind of similar to a conversation around a wallet and saying, hey, this isn't a production wallet. Like you can use it however you see fit, but it's mostly meant for dev and test. Don't assume it's doing great protection around your key or literally any protection around your key. And then of course the wallet that we want to deem the official supported community wallet for these platforms, it needs to have a certain level. So it kind of feels a little bit like that. So I would say, I definitely say that's a good approach. Can I give you a to-do task? And in the notes doc, I threw like a little bullet thing here. Maybe just add a couple of little notes with some links to those repos. And then again, let's also, continue the conversation in probably a new thread on Slack and let people chime in. The core devs will probably hop on and give input on that one as well. And this is perfect. And again, this is all being recorded. So those that maybe want more context that, come onto the Slack and go back. But, if we have enough links and continue the conversation, it should be able to move forward. Yeah, definitely. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, this is great to know. Thank you.
Python SHA-3 timing.
It's not so much SHA-3 because Python has built-in support for SHA-3, but the problem is that ED25519 requires external modules, and so either you have to build in everything, either you have to do the entire algorithm in Python, which then is susceptible to Python or to timing attacks, as well as other side channel attacks, or you can build it in C, which alleviates those concerns, but then requires a C compiler at some level.
Okay, so I just want to make a note, so it's just here for us, again, future reference, anyone who's kind of going back to it. Okay, nice. The last thing I had, again, anyone else bring up stuff, anyone else who has topics that aren't GraphQL related, please throw it in the chat. And so GraphQL was brought up yesterday, and definitely more relevant here in the API one than we were talking about. Yesterday was clients and wallets and block explorers. So again, we don't have to dig too much into it, just, bring it up as a topic. So the idea, is that someone or some group or multiple groups are actively working on a GraphQL interface into the REST gateway, potentially. Maybe. That's what I kind of understood. So I guess anyone who is that person and you're on this, can you maybe raise your hand or drop a comment in chat? And if not, then I'll just kind of generally talk to it. Any of the GraphQL people here? Okay. So anyway, so this was brought up yesterday by someone who was in the client meeting. So, I mean, for those that aren't familiar, I mean, the current REST gateway is, the front end that, development is going to talk to over the REST interface. For those of you that are probably heard of GraphQL or not, or, if you've been developing for the past few years, it's become such a big thing. It's just basically another kind of like data formats that has a lot of added advantages, especially at the client level. If you're using things like React or other related, Relay and other libraries, it's a great data-driven way to define your kind of app state, plus a bunch of other stuff for disparate data sources. So, being born out of Facebook, GraphQL excels at kind of this data-driven, state-based abstraction to say, this view in this app needs this data, and I don't want to have to write all the glue code to like query, cache, merge into these objects, especially when instead of querying a REST interface that makes one database call, in the case of like a Facebook or large orgs, they might have upwards of 50 to 100 web service calls going on behind the scenes through different data stores and then merging that back in. So that's where the graph comes from. So anyways, so people have brought it up before and someone actively brought it up. I think in general, it's a great idea. My hope would be, this is something that requires a bigger topic, probably like a good chunk of a meeting. The hope would be that it's something that could be applied onto the side of the current REST gateway, so that someone could optionally launch an API server with the default REST interface, and then maybe configure it and add on a GraphQL interface. Again, there's pluses and minuses. Pluses, if you have an app that you want to integrate in, and you're already using GraphQL on that app, and you want to add network stuff in, you kind of get it for quote unquote free-ish. The downside is, we're kind of integrating one data source, but that might change over time. But I do think it's good. And I think someone made some comment that, given the popularity and usage of Mongo in the web and in kind of Node and JavaScript community, there's already kind of the, bindings and wrappers for Mongo, and, we can use that directly inside of our world. That being said, Mongo is a current dependency that we will probably be swapping out of as an optional one, over the rest of this year at some point. But anyways, so that's the GraphQL topic. The people that are working on it, I assume will be popping up. But if you are interested in it, we will bring that up as a topic on some future group meeting. Just like everything else, they'll kind of start on Slack, and we'll probably have some comments and stuff. So I guess we'll stop there. We kind of went over a little bit. So thanks everyone for staying on. I'll pause. And anyone else have any kind of closing questions or topics or anything?
Yeah, I posted in the chat, but basically I was just curious, why is the SDK guideline repo archived?
Let's see. Maybe I can't give you an exact answer. Maybe because of just maintenance, like not actively maintaining and adding to it. I see David's unmuting.
Yeah, I can give a better overview. Basically, we moved that the repo was started in there, but basically we move it to the documentation. So in order to don't have like two repos with the same information, that would be like difficult to maintain, we opt to only update it in the docs. So if you go to the docs and go to the sidebar, there is a section that is called contribute or contributing. And in there is a whole section where all the guidelines are being updated. So it doesn't make sense to have like a lot of repos with double information. It's better to have all in one place. And for maintenance point of view, it's better.
Okay. I didn't realize it was in the docs now.
Yeah.
Cool. Anyone else? Questions, comments, etc.?
I should have the modified version, so if I'll just probably be asking in the SIG API some questions just about a C version of the ED25519 algorithm later on. But that should be it.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely bring it up there. I saw that you added, you had updated the little notes. So yeah, throw it up there, start the conversation, see what kind of feedback starts to float in. And since you're kind of most actively both in the Slack and then working on obviously one of the next Python SDKs, definitely like, push the limits of trying to get feedback and enablement for yourself, right? So just constantly, chime in, ask questions, and definitely treat. I'm not assigning them tasks, but treat Greg and Shintat and anyone else who's working on the JavaScript or Java ones as sounding boards and learning, right? Different language, but they're going through the kind of same growing pains of onboarding to the protocol and the implementation. And the hope is, as painful it is for number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, it gets more painful due to documentation and tooling and approaches to testing and whatnot. So yeah, everything you've been doing is great so far.
Perfect, thanks.
Cool. I guess that's it. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you on the Slack and in the next meeting.
Thanks.
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 Good night and goodbye.
Thanks,
Guys.
bye.
Bye.
Thanks.